More and more people are waking up to the power of design and the impact it can have on addressing complex global challenges. And in particular, design for the circular economy, or circular design, has captured the attention of innovators and entrepreneurs and businesses around the world. Now, you might be more familiar with the innovations coming from tech startups or large multinationals, but circular design has relevance around the world, and today we're going to hear from some practicing designers from Sub Saharan Africa. My name's Joe Isles. I lead our circular design work here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We work with businesses, policymakers, educators, designers, and other stakeholders around the world to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. And as part of that mission, we run live online conversations just like this one. Thanks for joining us today. This can only be a conversation if you get involved. We're streaming on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and we'll be keeping an eye out for your questions and comments throughout the session. So do post them, and our community managers will pick them up and send them throughout the conversation today. So for this discussion on circular design in Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm joined by three fantastic speakers. Maxwell Mutanda of Studio Detail in Zimbabwe, Isatu Harrison of Azealia in Sierra Leone, and Hannah Robinson, a bit closer to home, at the British Council in London. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to our discussion, but I think we need a bit of scene setting first. And Hannah, I'm going to come to you for that. You're an integral kind of keystone in this conversation today. How are we all together speaking about circular design?
Absolutely. So I lead a number of our programs at the Architecture, Design and Fashion Department at the British Council. And our role is really to create new collaborations between UK designers, cultural institutions, and different designers, practitioners, collectives all around the world. And increasingly, we really use our programs to respond to global challenges. So in this case, the Circular Design Lab was set up in 2018. So we collaborated with yourselves, with the Circular Design team, to develop a pilot. And the aim of this program is really to create a mutual exchange and a really international dialogue around circular design, and really start to understand some of the nuances and think about how the circular economy manifests in very different ways in different contexts in different countries. So the first Circular Design Lab took place with a group of designers from 5 countries in Southeast Asia. And the second Circular Design Lab happened in December, which was a little bit bigger, with participants from 10 countries across Sub-Saharan Africa. So these practitioners were from very different disciplines, from architecture, textiles, design, fashion, creative entrepreneurship, but really all united in terms of their kind of vision around circularity and what that means to them. So it's kind of very exciting, obviously, for me to be joined by 2 of the designers here today and yourselves, and discuss their work a little bit further. To give a little kind of overview of the design of the program, essentially the designers all meet in London for a week of workshops, which are led by relevant practitioners from the industry, and the Circular Design Guide forms the framework of that week. And then after the week's workshops, the designers all submit a proposal for a grant for a follow-on project to really create their own regional projects within their own creative ecosystems, and disseminate the learnings further, which is the really, really exciting bit for me.
Thanks, Hannah. We'll discuss that in a bit more detail a bit later on. But now let's come to Isatu and Maxwell as the practitioners in this conversation. Can you also kind of set the scene for us a bit? So what type of designers are you? Is it designing shoes or buildings or electronics? What are your, when you're practitioners, but what are you creating? Maxwell, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Joe. So I have a background in architecture, and I'm very interested in sustainable urban development. So a lot of my work really looks at not just the built environment, but also the systems that involve the built environment. So that could include waste as well as, say, trade, particularly informal trade, and then informal housing and non-standard work in general.
And you, Isatu?
My background is fashion design. My interest is in natural dyes, and I am creating a space, a maker space, where we can experiment with the natural and vegetables that we have in our community.
Thank you. And maybe you could continue, Isatu, by just saying how you came to learn about the circular economy, or what some of the journey so far has been like.
Oh my goodness. So I learned about circular economy through the British Council here in Sierra Leone. I lived in the UK for some time, and then I moved to Sierra Leone about 18 months, 2 years ago. But I've been in contact or in touch with like the British Council in Sierra Leone, and I learned about circular economy through them. And I was the delegate from Sierra Leone. But my interest, like I said, is around natural dyes, in creating natural dyes. So when I heard about the circular economy, in fact, it was the first time I had the term circular economy. So I got really interested. And when I went for the circular lab 1 week in London, I learned so much, and it's just became a lot of there's a lot of interest in it since I came back, and I've been holding a lot of workshops, and hopefully the space that I'm creating, we're opening it in April, and we can give access to young and upcoming designers, whether fashion designers or people who are interested in circular economy in general, to have a space where they can come and learn about this.
I just want to pick on something you mentioned there. You said it was the first time you heard of circular economy, but you were already practicing using natural dyes in your work before that. So this was nothing new to you.
No, but then there was no word for it. So this is why I say in Africa, especially, the practice of circularity has been in existence for some time, but then people didn't know what it's called, or it's not formal. So having a name to it now makes a lot more sense, and it's a way of encouraging local people, communities, to join into the practice. And I think when we have a name to it, it makes more sense.
Okay,
yes?
yeah. Well, Maxwell, does that chime with your experience as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Isatu is saying. I think Africa as a whole, as a continent, has a lot of sort of embedded knowledge, particularly indigenous knowledge systems that have really sort of promoted and utilized circular principles. So if I think of the built environment, a lot of the materials that we use are natural, and they sort of follow the life cycle of nature within the way we design products. So, and in the present day, in say 21st century Africa, we're really part of this sort of global conversation of the reuse of materials, right? So you have a lot of, say, clothing that's sent from foreign countries to Africa that finds a second life. You have a lot of motor vehicles that come from, say, the United Kingdom or Japan to countries in Africa, so that vehicles have a life beyond that which they have in the markets that they're designed for.
And you've spoken a bit about some of the innate or existing practices that relate to a circular economy, but are there other big shifts or trends happening in Zimbabwe, or you can see elsewhere in Africa that you're responding to as designers, and do they overlap with the circular economy?
So when I started my design research firm with my partner, Safia Qureshi, she's actually based in London, we're really keen to look at social and environmental concerns that impact the built environment. And two very important things that impact Africa are a demographic shift. So you see that about 77% of the population in Africa is aged under 35. And a lot of those people are living more and more within an urban context. So rapid urbanization and the young population are very much what has driven this the move towards circular design and the circular economy on the continent because of this understanding that resources aren't finite anymore. We have a lot of space and land in Africa, so it was never really a concern as it is, say, within the global north.
Okay, so that's some of that local or some of the differences between the emergence of some of these practices in Africa compared with in Europe and North America and elsewhere, as you say. Isatu, can you comment on these trends as well, and maybe how you're finding your work and circular design generally what's the response to it in the context of some of these trends that Maxwell's mentioned?
I think for Sierra Leone or this part of Africa where I am, what I noticed is that people or communities have we need to reconnect with what we have, with the local materials, with the indigenous materials. Most of the times people depend on what's coming from abroad, and we do not really value what we have in the locality, in the community. So for me, my work, it's actually bringing us back into the indigenous, connecting communities with what we have locally and making good use of the products that we have. For example, in the tie-dye industry, we use a lot of kola nut. I don't know if you know what kola nut is. Kola nut is like a vegetable in this part of Africa. And most people do not realize that they can use kola nut in terms of colors to make a natural color out of kola nut. One of the workshops I held last week, we used kola nut to produce natural color, and we colored that with natural cotton. So it just brings us back to the indigenous things that we have and connecting these communities with the local things that we have and how we can make good use of that in terms of circularity.
Okay, and for those of us who, and I admit myself, I'm more familiar with circular design practices, perhaps across Europe, from maybe tech companies and things like that. And there's certain words or practices that we hear come up again and again with circular economy and design for a circular economy. Things like repair, remanufacturing, renting products rather than owning them, sharing economy, and things like that. So when I think circular design, those are some of the things that come to mind. But you haven't mentioned many of those things yet. So is the situation quite different? What are the leading circular design practices in Sierra Leone?
In Sierra Leone, we have a lot of repair, like Maxwell mentioned earlier on. We have a lot of reuse, so the term. But again, people don't know the terms. They don't know that, there's no name to it. So we do a lot of used clothing that comes from Europe or America, that people. So the term of reuse and repair, and lots of people, we have lots of small shops around locally where you see a lot of people take their shoes for repair. In Africa, the culture of throwing things is not very common because people cannot afford to throw anything away. I mean, if you see things thrown, then they're really tattered and torn and beyond beyond repairable. But people didn't know they don't have a name for it. They don't have an official term for it. So I think with circular design now that we're talking about it, there are so many terms that, names for it. We can educate the local people. We can educate our communities and just make it a little bit more formal and encourage more of that in the communities where we are.
Okay, and you mentioned making it more formal, or perhaps there are other ways that those practices could become more sophisticated, maybe safer or better for the people that participate in them. Maxwell, I know you think about this as well, how you can take some of those practices to the next level, maybe to a larger scale, or to improve safety or quality. But how do you do that without following some of the linear practices that we've found ourselves in the global north?
Thanks, Joe. That's a great question. I think Isatu mentioned something that was very keen. So it is all very much an economic imperative. So people are living their lives dependent on what things cost in their bottom line. So when people are buying reused clothing or reused building materials, they're not really considering it as part of, say, this reuse economy, right? But where they do sort of differ from, say, a European understanding is a lot of this work is being done within an informal sector in Africa. And so they're very much outside of sort of formal financial models. So they don't have access to bank loans, they don't have access to actual banking. You know, you may have a mobile banking that really meets their need. So bringing the circular economy into, say, formal practices is just getting people to understand the economic power of it, so that then people then have a basis from which to grow their businesses and make their lives better. So it's not as if circular practices aren't happening in Africa. It's just that they're so outside of, say, how a nation measures its GDP that they're not being valued.
Okay, that makes sense. And you said there that you mentioned again the indigenous practices or informal practices becoming more part of a picture about what the future economy looks like.
Yeah.
I think some of us who've been working in the circular economy space for a while hear this criticism from many different parts of the world that, oh, that's just going back to how my granddad used to do things, and circular economy being confused with a backward-looking approach to development, when actually a lot of people are saying this is a model for the future. So how do either of you reconcile those two things, that these are indigenous practices or skills or knowledge from the past that we're almost reinventing for the future?
I think just to start on that, I mean, it's a sort of understanding, say, if I think about the built environment, economically, there's been a great shift towards, say, shopping malls, large centers of commerce that are covered, that normally take up a large footprint. Whereas in Africa, there's this tradition of smaller scale, mainly roadside vendors, where people do most of their shopping. And so this shift isn't so much going backwards. You know, you have organizations like WeGo, which is Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And together with the International Labour Organization, they've really put out a lot of research that shows that globally, not just in the global south, but across the whole world, about 6 in 10 people are working within the informal economy. And we know that shopping malls are on the decline in America because as a model of capitalism, it doesn't work, right? It's unsustainable. So it isn't really looking back. It's to say, going forward, what is a sustainable practice of the economy that includes more and more people? So in that way, it does take the lessons from the past, but it really looks to serve the future and address the problems that the present is dealing with.
Thank you, Maxwell. I've just been told that we've got people online from many different countries around the world, from Indonesia, Australia, Vietnam, and almost every country across Western Europe online at the moment, which makes me think, if we've got such an international audience, we're hearing from practitioners from Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone. Are there learnings or elements that can be transported? You've described a type of circular design that's very contextually relevant to the trends and experiences of your cities and countries. But are there elements that can translate? Isatu, perhaps you could take that one.
Absolutely, and I think that's what the whole circular design encourages us to do. So I think what we can is exchange ideas on materials as well. It's about material intelligence. Sometimes we have the materials locally and we don't know how to use them, and possibly Hannah in London, like we did the exchange, you know, we met so many different people from different parts of the world. We can swap ideas in terms of materials, how we can use materials in different continents, and how useful they are. And I think that's on its own, it's really important in terms of material intelligence, in terms of community connectivity as well. I think it's also another area that we can swap ideas.
And by that you mean pooling global knowledge or experience on circular design and exchanging information.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And is that happening anywhere now that you see, or is that's a latent opportunity?
I think with our group of circular design labs designers, we're kind of doing that now, isn't it, Maxwell? We're exchanging ideas a lot. We're talking about what's happening in our different countries, and when we have like roadblocks, when we're stuck with some ideas, we kind of discuss it in the group, or get in touch with people in the area that that we think, designers that we think have knowledge in the area that we're working.
Well, Maxwell, maybe you could pick that up just with a little build from me here. That you two obviously you're kind of at the vanguard. We're speaking to two designers who understand circular economy and what the opportunity is, and build on their own experience with a view to a model that works in the future. But what's the untapped opportunity, or what, maybe to put it another way, what would unlock a whole wave of circular designers just like you, a whole new generation of practitioners who think and act the same way?
Thanks, Joe. I think one of the things that is a word that translates across different cultures is scalability. So I think what was so great about our involvement within the Circular Design Lab is that it was 10 of us, but within that small group, we were able to identify, say, value chains across countries and regionally. And in being able to identify that for ourselves, we're able to identify that for, say, our different industries, whether that's fashion and textiles, or architecture in the built environment, or product design. And then that can then scale up to include the whole continent. So we're at this amazing point where the continent is looking towards creating a free trade zone from Cape to Cairo, right? And so there's a definite potential for the circular economy to really take advantage of that ability to work across different countries, across different regions, as Isatu mentioned, grow material knowledge that affects communities, whether in Sierra Leone or Mozambique. And I think that's a great way to start. So we've been able, as she's mentioned, to talk within our own group, find points of similarity or difference and learn from them. And those are just examples that I think can translate beyond just 10 people or 10 organizations or 10 countries, but include all, say, 52 countries on the continent, and then really scale across different regions in the world.
Thanks, Maxwell. We're going to come back to you and Isatu in a few minutes, so do stay with us. Just a reminder, the circular designers were brought here together today via a program run between the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the British Council last year called the Circular Design Lab. And now we're going to hear another voice by way of video from another participant in that. It's Wasi Zacharias from Mozambique.
My name is Wasi Zacharias, and I'm from Mozambique. I'm a textile designer and accessory designer, interested in agricultural waste and just sustainable design in general. I think this week has been really insightful to help me frame my narrative better, because when you're on the field and you're doing stuff, sometimes you lose track of how to kind of plan your whole work. And I think the key takeaways are that we're not crazy. We're doing something that's important, and definitely keeping a door open to collaborate with other people in different fields is very, very important. And just making sure that we spread the message, and so we're teaching other people about circular design and circular economy. I think the biggest barrier is that your market is probably not ready. At least in Africa, that's an issue. People don't understand what sustainability really is, or circularity, because you're dealing with people who are worried about what are they going to eat next. So whether it comes from an organic source or whether it is done in the correct way, to them it doesn't really matter, because they're worried about more primary needs. And that feels like kind of secondary or tertiary even. I think it's kind of obvious that the biggest benefit is that we get to live in this planet a little bit longer in better conditions. Right now, we're not being smart about the way we do things. And I think definitely one of the biggest things that we have to keep in mind, and I think one of the biggest benefits for Africa is because we lack resources, we already do a lot of sustainable things without knowing. And I think the biggest thing is to maintain it that way. So even if we advance, even if we have more technology, how do you remain sustainable? How do you learn from the mistakes of the West even, and kind of say, we're not going to go down that road?
Wasi Zacharias there from Mozambique, talking about the emergence of circular design, or design for a circular economy in Sub-Saharan Africa. Amazing learnings there, certainly for many of us who are watching now or participating in this conversation with a pretty European or global north lens. It's amazing to hear how the circular design has a contextual relevance in different parts of the world. Hannah Robinson from the British Council, we're going to come to you now. You, as we said before the video, you organised this circular design lab that brought many designers together last year from Sub-Saharan Africa and the year before that from Southeast Asia. Let's talk about design maybe a bit more generally. When a lot of people think design, maybe they just think of aesthetics and a beautifully designed physical product. But we're talking more broadly than that, aren't we?
Absolutely. I think we're all aware that design does not exist in a vacuum. It touches every kind of part of our lives. And when we're thinking about the future landscape and the kind of opportunities and challenges that we're facing, we need people that have skills in really different areas to collaborate and work together. And that could be people who are more traditional design disciplines like architects, product designers. It could also be people like food designers, people who work with agriculture, as Wasi mentioned, and people that are able to intersect into very different systems, whether that's kind of food systems within cities, different kind of material streams. And I think something that really kind of is very clear after the Circular Design Lab is also how the kind of idea of materials really links all of this together as well, and material language and material literacy.
Thank you. You mentioned you've done two of these now, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. What do you notice after 2 years, just from those two parts of the world? What are the big differences between circular design and the trends or stories that you're hearing?
I think, as we kind of discussed earlier, circular design or the circular economy, or how we define circular design, the language we use is really important, because it's not always called circular design. And, I think the kind of language and the kind of semantics we use is something that's also a kind of new area that needs more exploration. Working between the different regions is really exciting, because, of course, you have the nuances which are kind of in line with more kind of context and opportunity. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, we had a lot of designers who were looking at biological systems and bioplastics and areas within kind of ocean plastics and ocean waste. Within kind of the recent cohort, Sub-Saharan Africa, as we've been discussing, we had a lot of really, really exciting kind of designers looking at repair, reuse, new kind of systems that look at textiles specifically, secondhand clothing. So, I think going back to Isatu's point, I think it's really about collaboration and sharing knowledge. We need to think globally about this topic. Of course, we need to think on an international level. People from all different regions need to be included in this discussion, but also we do need to think about local nuances and more kind of locally specific opportunities as well.
Well, circular economy isn't a branded term, and no one owns it. It's a concept or an idea. But how do you avoid the misconception or accusation that that it is trying to act as a one kind of one size fits all approach or a cookie cutter approach?
I think it really goes back to that idea of language and thinking about how we describe what circular design is and the different kind of nuances within that. And there's no kind of right or wrong answer. It's very different for each specific context. And for me, that's a really exciting thing. And I think, viewing circularity also in a context of how it can be a really powerful catalyst for creativity and new creative ideas. I think that's also a really important way to look at it, in line with kind of talking to designers from very different contexts and countries.
We've had some good questions and comments in so far. Francesco on LinkedIn says, I agree. Best practice exchange is the only way to understand if there are scalable ways to accelerate and scale up processes. So support for that idea around knowledge exchange. We've got some other good questions coming in. I'll get to them in just a moment, but don't forget to send them in. We've got just over 10 minutes left in this session, so plenty of time to ask your questions to our guests today. Coming back to that point around materiality, you said that's been a common theme, Hannah, in the workshops that you've done, and you've been working in the design space for a number of years now. Presumably you don't meet any designers who set out to send materials to landfill or incineration or to lose them from the economy.
Absolutely not. Yet to meet a designer that designs for landfill.
So why does it happen then?
It's a good question. Like, I read an interesting statistic the other day. I think it's when we think about kind of fashion and textiles, I think it's something like 73% of all fibers that go into clothing end up in landfill or are incinerated. And it's a massive challenge. And for me, I think, it kind of falls down to two points we could look at. One is kind of extending the life of things. A very interesting designer who was part of the Circular Design Lab called Matthew Edwards in South Africa looks at repairing football boots, for example, works with different townships in Johannesburg, and really thinks about design for disassembly and design for repair. And I think, another kind of interesting design challenge and opportunity here is thinking about kind of biodegradable materials. Saw an interesting kind of trainer that's been developed, I think it was in Canada, which is designed to just decompose. So, I think we obviously need to kind of stop shipping so many products around the world and waste around the world, and also try and think on a more local level when thinking about materials, and allowing designers as well to make more responsible material choices.
You just described really the global economic system of moving products around the world, and there'll presumably many designers who feel a bit powerless in that global system. Maxwell and Isatu, we can come back to them in just a moment, but seem very independent and autonomous designers. Many would be beholden to the briefs that they're getting from above, maybe within a large corporation, and maybe don't feel that they have that agency. What's your advice to those designers, or how can we empower them?
I think it's really about making small changes at a local level where possible. Every designers obviously exist in very different contexts, whether they're working in a more commercial practice or whether they're able to work on more kind of socially or environmentally engaged projects. I think, one thing that is really important is all working towards the same framework. We have these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I think really designers uniting to all work towards the same goals is something that's really, really important, because there's also a danger of kind of us all working away in different silos to kind of reach the same goal. And for us thinking about goal 17, which is partnerships towards the goal, that's a really important one. How can we unite different bodies of research? How can we provide a platform and enable more designers globally to collaborate and unlock new opportunities around circular design?
If I could just bring in Maxwell and Isatu back into the conversation now, I'd be interested in your take on that. Studio Detail is you and Safia Qureshi, you said, Maxwell, and Isatu, you seem to have a lot of autonomy over what you create and the decisions that you make during the design process. Is that how it feels? Do you feel that you do have the power to make almost any decision that can influence whether what you create is linear or circular? Or are you trapped in the same linear systems that we find elsewhere?
No, I feel definitely. I feel like I have the power to create whatever I want to create, and I think this is where the designers, young designers, have power to contribute in terms of circular design, because we have the power. We need to think we need to think about the materials we bring into the market. We need to think about the designs we bring into the market globally. At a local level, we need to talk to each other. We need to collaborate and bring in the right materials in the market. We have a lot of powers in what we bring into market, but I think where then the bigger players come in, like governments. So for me, I think locally, what I've been realizing is that whilst we have powers to design the things we want to design, to bring the things to market, we need the bigger players, we need governments, we need policies to help us in terms of marketing these designs, in terms of what comes into the country. Like Maxwell mentioned earlier in our discussion, we have a lot of reused materials that come in, and some of them, in fact, yesterday I was having a discussion at a workshop. Some of these materials, they're not bringing them into Africa because they're thinking of reuse, the term reuse, repair. It's almost like a dumping ground. They're finding where places to dump all the materials or the products that are not in use in Europe. So where do they send them? They send them to this part of the world where people can't afford to buy new. People can't afford to get things that they need. But because of the affordability, they will go for the used things, almost things that nobody wants. They send them here. So I think for designers locally, whilst we can, we have to think about the materials we use, we think about what we bring to market. It would also help if government or, policies, we have policies across borders that help us control what comes in terms of just bringing reused materials, in terms of using these places as dumping ground, and that would help us in terms of marketing our designs locally. It would help us in terms of thinking about what we have and how we can make use of it.
There's a huge point here around policy and international policy, which maybe relates to some of the what's happened with the Chinese national sword policy, with blocking waste being dumped in China as well, and the knock-on effects in recycling systems and material systems around the world. Hopefully, our viewers can dig into that in the comments, because I want to get onto some of the questions that have been coming in, especially one around something you mentioned earlier, Maxwell, about the trend of the demographic trend in Africa and the youth population. So one of the questions we've had in was that we need to create job opportunities for this huge growing youth population. So is the circular economy being seen in that light, that there are job opportunities within that, or is it too early to say?
No, I think that's a great point. I think especially leading on to what Isatu was talking about, and I think Ellen MacArthur Foundation is very good at understanding that the role of the circular economy is to contribute towards financial sustainability. So you find that, say, government and policymakers, their primary concern is to meet the demands of their citizens, and large organizations also have financial sustainability at the forefront of their mind. So when I am working, or when Isatu is working, that is also a consideration that we have, is this idea to say, we'd like to do the work that satisfies us professionally and creatively, but we want that work to be financially sustainable for ourselves and for other people. And there's a role for the circular economy and beyond that, cultural and creative economies to contribute towards job creation, because it hasn't been considered thoroughly enough to say, okay, how are we going to create the jobs for the future, especially for the youth across the continent? We cannot keep replicating the economic models that have already come before us or that are currently existing, because they have proven to be insufficient.
Thanks, Maxwell. Loads of support coming in for the points you're making. Meredith saying that alignment with SDGs is a very good way to focus all stakeholder efforts. Mark saying it's so true. It's so easy for us designers to spec clever materials that will never biodegrade. That's a pretty optimistic standpoint. I hope it is easy for more designers to do that. We had an interesting one come in earlier from Peter, I believe, who said, under which conditions does a circular local economy evolve best? And on the contrary, what are the circular economy killers? So what would stifle a circular economy locally? Any thoughts on that?
I will go back to a point that's been raised. Isatu talked a lot about the market. I think when people are designing for the circular economy, one has to also consider how that comes across and comes up against linear processes. So it's always to say, how can this be competitive? Or what are the value additions that will get people to understand the benefits of circular design within the economy? Otherwise, people will just stick with the status quo, right? And perpetuate linear processes. I'll give you an example of why I think the foundation has seen a lot of partnerships with larger organizations. You have a lot of drinks manufacturers had a shortage of, their preferred bottling material, PET plastic, in South Africa last year. So you would go and find a shortage of the linear materials that they're used to, because the demand was great or the supply was low. So people are looking to circular processes not just because there is a clear and present need, but because of what it means for their market. Everyone wants to be able to bring their products to market continuously and without disruption. And circular design and circular principles allow a continual flow of products to market that I think a lot of larger organizations are coming to terms with.
Thanks, Maxwell. I'm just going to ask one question for each of you to finish off here. And it's a forward-looking question. What do you think the next milestone is for circular design to scale in your home countries? And maybe, Hannah, we could start with you, and maybe you could speak to the Circular Design Lab generally and what the next milestone there is in this thread of work.
I think for us, the next milestone is really uniting all of the different kind of stakeholders within this program, and also creating a broader network and almost an assembly of organizations, designers, collectives at all different levels who can go on and work together in this, and also inspire others and really have creativity at the heart of this as well.
And you, Isatu? What's the next milestone in Sierra Leone? Oh, you're on mute at the moment. We'd love to hear what you're saying, though.
Sorry about that, Joe. But I think in Sierra Leone, for me, what I'm concentrating on right now is teaming up, collaborating with creators, with designers, so that we can have a global, we can contribute to the global market of circular economy products. But also, in terms of government and policies, what I'm also thinking of doing is to organize a circular summit where we can bring all these players together, and then we can look at cross-border MOUs, for example, that would help the local designers, so that when we design things, when we use the right kind of materials, we're able to market them as well.
Thank you, Isatu. And finish us off, Maxwell. What's the next big milestone for circular design in Zimbabwe?
I would say education, and I think the EMF is quite forward thinking on this. It's this idea that the curriculum has to change at all levels of education. So, you see like Italy putting climate change on the curriculum at schools. I think for circular design and the circular economy to be taken up by the populations across the continent is that policymakers have to really put it right front and center within the way people learn about all subjects, geographies, as well as all science-based subjects, really need to start including the circular economy and circular design within the way children and adults learn.
Maxwell, Isatu, and Hannah, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about circular design. It was a pleasure having you be part of this live stream.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks to our superb speakers today on the topic of circular design in Sub Saharan Africa, and for all your fantastic questions and comments that you've been sending in throughout the conversation. I think today we've seen that circular design, whilst it's a global movement, it has a powerful and profound local and personal relevance for designers and innovators in different parts of the world. Don't forget, you can check out the Circular Design Guide, circulardesignguide.com, to get started with the practice of circular design, and find the circular design community on LinkedIn, which has around 16,000 practicing or aspiring circular designers in there, getting started with some of that knowledge exchange that we heard was so important today. Don't forget to tune in to many more of the live online sessions today and tomorrow here from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Thanks for joining today, and see you next time.